topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to the Ask the Expert show on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV, where we bring you educational information from top local experts in the fields of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. Now sit back and listen to experts in family law, association law, hearing loss, business brokers, home care, along with many other topics. Now here are your hosts, Steve-O and Sophia.
Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to another Ask the Expert show. I'm your host for the next 50 minutes. I am Steve-O. If you knew what my last name was, you would understand why I just used the letter O. Hey, we have got a great show for you today. It's a topic that we see it advertised all the time. We were able to find one of the finest law firms. The name of the firm is Mandelbrot Law Firm. And I got to tell you, first of all, Michael, I got to wish you a happy new year.
Steve, it's always great to see you. I'm always so happy to be here. And I just want to say that I do hope everyone in the Southeast is doing okay following Hurricane Helene. I know there has been a lot of tragedy and a lot of damage out there. And so I do want to send out my regards to anybody listening who was impacted by the hurricane.
God, Michael, thank you so much. The bad part is there's another one down there, and they said it could be taken the same route. So that's a little scary, especially after what's going on in North Carolina.
I can't even imagine. I've seen some of the pictures and the videos, and I don't even know how you even start to clean up something like that. And especially now with another one on the horizon, it's pretty scary. It really is.
Yeah, but look, you got earthquakes, though.
That's what everyone worries about. I got to say, in 30 years, I've only felt two earthquakes.
Well, I remember the one in Oakland.
Bay Area in 89 and the Napa earthquake about 10 years ago.
Well, the one in Oakland was bad because I remember seeing the bridges just fall apart. And there was I think the Giants were playing that day. And
of course,
it was crazy.
Yeah, you can never forget it if you lived here or grew up here, but it was unbelievable, and let's just hope there isn't another one.
Well, Michael, you chose to go into an area of law that it's such a specialized area. And first of all, thank God for attorneys like you. This is all you do, is that right?
It really is. I've dedicated my career now 30 years to representing victims of asbestos diseases. And there's so many things that I really actually like about the litigation, things that, on a personal level make me feel good. These are generally clients from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people who really need help. And if there wasn't somebody like me to bridge the gap for them, and as happens with many people, they end up passing away without seeing the compensation they deserve. So, I can really appreciate helping these people. And the second thing is, in my industry, we always work on a contingency. We never send out bills to our clients. The only way we make money as lawyers is essentially if we win, if we are successful for our clients. And never having to send a bill to a client, that also makes me feel good. I don't want to be watching the clock every 5 minutes and billing a client, every 10 minutes and billing. That's time I can spend working on these cases, working on these claims, and helping victims. So those two things alone really every day sort of motivate me and make me feel good about what I'm doing in helping these victims.
Michael, you do so much work before you've realized your first dime.
We do. And, we don't mind investing the money in getting medical records and social security records and putting the case together medically by dealing with experts, radiologists, physicians of internal medicine. And it's very important for us to put these cases together properly and to get people compensated. And, in many of these cases, if it's a trial, oftentimes 6 figures is put forward before you see a dime. But even with the bankruptcy claims, we're putting forward probably $5,000 per client in order to work them up properly, and before we even ever see any money from these trusts or from a defendant. So there is a big investment. You're right.
I got to share this with everybody because I think it's something to be very proud of. YouTube does a great job promoting all of our shows. And right before the show, I was actually didn't know if I was going to answer the phone or not. But right before the show, we had a law firm that specializes in asbestos who's actually been listening to your show, telling us what a great job you've done on the show. And they wanted a show like that. Michael was our only one, and we like to keep it that way. But what a compliment from your peers.
Well, I appreciate that. And a lot of these attorneys who represent victims of asbestos disease from around the country, I do know them personally. There are a couple of conferences around the country each year, but I don't want to say we're all the same. There are some lawyers who really, I think, are only in it for the money, only want to help victims of mesothelioma. And really, it for them, it is all about the money. For me, it's all about helping these victims get compensated if they have an asbestos disease, no matter what the disease is. And I truthfully think in some cases, severe asbestosis, I don't want to say it's worse than mesothelioma, but if somebody's got mesothelioma, your life expectancy is, say, 6 to 18 months. And that is absolutely awful. But if you've got severe asbestosis, ultimately what's going to happen is you're probably going to, at some point, suffocate to death. And the problem is your breathing is going to be impaired for the next 15 years, not, 6 months to 18 months. And so really, in a lot of cases, I feel victims of asbestosis have it just as bad, if not in some cases worse, because of the long-term impact of asbestosis that, I always want to make sure that I help these people, no matter the disease, and no matter if I'm going to make, $1 million in a case. That's not what's important. What's important is helping these people.
What's the difference in the two? Because I hear you say mesothelioma or asbestos. What's the difference between the two?
Great question, Steve. And everybody sees those commercials on TV. Mesothelioma. Call this number. Mesothelioma. Get your free book. Mesothelioma. We've recovered billions. Call us. Mesothelioma is a cancer with one known cause. The only cause of mesothelioma is exposure to asbestos. So if somebody has mesothelioma, which is a cancer to the lining of the lung, not the actual lung, the lining of the lung, it's an they can treat it, but it's an incurable cancer. It just grows like a web around the lung. So mesothelioma is a malignancy or a cancer to the lining of the lung. Asbestosis, while it is not cancer, it is a severe disease of the lungs and the pleural, meaning the lining as well. A severe disease, but not cancer. So that is the big difference. Mesothelioma, it's basically asbestosis that has developed into cancer in a lot of ways, where asbestosis is a disease, a scarring, a fibrosis to the lining of the lungs and the lungs themselves, also caused by asbestos. Asbestosis, though, or interstitial fibrosis, as some people call it, does have other possible causes. There is some dispute amongst the medical community, and they say, well, this could be caused in part by exposure to other chemicals and fumes, exposure to cigarette smoke, for example. Mesothelioma, they are, I've got to say, the greatest cases in the world, because when you've got a mesothelioma case, there's only one known cause: exposure to asbestos. So your causation is already there, which is a big part of any legal case. Asbestosis cases, more experts have to prove the disease. There's a more defenses to asbestosis. Mesothelioma, they've come up with there was a monkey virus in Kenya that causes mesothelioma. Well, nobody's had that monkey virus. And then now they're trying to say some people are genetically predisposed to get mesothelioma, which I think is a load of crap as well. The fact is, and what medical science has shown, the only cause of mesothelioma is exposure to asbestos, which, as we've discussed, asbestos was in hundreds, if not thousands, of products.
Michael, I tell you what blew my mind. When we did the first show, it was a 30-minute show. And I couldn't believe the comments that we got saying the show wasn't long enough. And we extended it to 50 minutes. And I got to tell you, I did not realize there's so much information that we could fill up a whole 50-minute show.
Yeah, there really is, whether it's about exposure, the different types of products, trials themselves, the $30 billion out there in bankruptcy claims. There's so many different topics to discuss. It is a very complex litigation that I try and simplify for the listeners so they can understand it better.
But it seems like it's really hard to prove, though, when you get to court.
It is. And, in a lot of ways, we lean on our, we'll call them our forefathers of asbestos litigation, who have litigated many of these cases, because you're right, it is very difficult to prove, but once you get close to trial, there's that risk to the defendant that you're going to be successful. And if you are successful in trial, there has been asbestosis verdicts well in excess of $5 million. And oftentimes, to settle these cases at a fraction of the $5 million, to face that risk, like our forefather, our older asbestos attorneys now retired, who have taken these cases to trial, what you find is 98% of cases settle. They settle because there is that huge risk to the defendants of us going into trial and ringing the bell. And you're right, it is difficult to prove, and that's something you weigh as you're negotiating a settlement with the defendant. How difficult was this case going to be to prove? How much exposure was there to that particular company's product? How much exposure was there at that refinery if you're going after, a premises defendant, for example? So, those are all issues you weigh when you negotiate a settlement. But thankfully, with regards to asbestosis cases, very difficult to prove. But I'd say in the last 10 years, I've probably seen 2 asbestosis verdicts, cases taken to trial and ultimately a verdict before resolving. I mean, these cases oftentimes maybe even get to trial. We had a case, it had maybe 6 defendants left. It had what's known as trial call. So you go and you get sent out to a judge. The case got sent out to a judge, was scheduled to open within a week or 1 week following once we got sent to the judge. Within that 1 week, 5 of the 6 remaining defendants settled. That left 1 defendant left at trial. We opened against that defendant, and that defendant put on a very good defense in opening. And at that point, we had to weigh the risk of taking that all the way to trial or settling with them. And in that case, having gotten fairly large settlements from the 5 of the 6 remaining defendants, and knowing that our case was relatively weak against the last remaining defendant, we settled that case after opening statements. So a lot of cases get into trial and they even settle. But yes, they are very difficult to prove. Mesothelioma, not as difficult because you're really looking only for any appreciable exposure or any significant exposure. Asbestosis cases, we're looking more at the volume of exposure and the extent of exposure to a particular product. But mesothelioma, like I said, those are the greatest cases in the world.
I'm going to take you down memory lane. About 12, 15 years ago, here in Florida, there were homes, new homes, and they said that they had asbestos in the walls. And actually, people had to sue the developers because of people were getting sick. Is that the same thing?
It is. It is very much, that, if I recall, was related. And, again, I don't want to be impart any sort of, I don't want to call it racism or any problem. But what this related to was drywall, which was imported primarily from, I believe, China.
Yes.
And that drywall, because starting in about 1973, all of the big drywall companies stopped using asbestos, as far as they knew, as a component in their drywall. It wasn't intentionally put in. But these same sort of regulations weren't in place in China. And what happened was, I believe, a developer who built, hundreds, if not thousands of homes, got his drywall, because it was cheaper, from China. And so ultimately these people realized it, and these homes were, effectively, I don't want to call them unsafe, but I wouldn't be comfortable living in them.
Yes. That was
I wouldn't be comfortable living in them.
But you don't hear about it anymore.
You don't hear about it a lot because, when you do the math, we're talking about homes built now 50 years ago. And it just shows how old, because when I say 72, Steve, probably to you that seems not like yesterday, but, we were both born in the 1900s. In the 1960s or 70s. So 72 just seems like, oh yeah, not that long ago, but that's now 52 years ago. And that's about when most companies did take asbestos out of their drywall products. And that's why you don't hear about it a lot anymore, because we're talking about much older homes, a lot of them which have been remodeled in the past 52 years, where drywall has been removed. The big one throughout the 60s, the 70s, and even into the 80s was those popcorn ceilings. Across the country, you'd see them everywhere. Those ceilings you could touch and they'd rain down on you. And of course, they stopped making those. They stopped manufacturing or building houses with those sorts of ceilings in about 1977, 78, maybe a little bit later into the early 80s. So that's why you don't see a lot of it anymore. I get calls every week from people who say, I just found asbestos in my home. What do I do? And these aren't the people who I represent. I'm happy to talk to them, try and encapsulate it, make sure it's not friable or something that can become dusty is typically the advice that I give them. But the problem with asbestos that we've talked about is when you're exposed, you don't get sick right away. It's not like if you're exposed to some noxious fume and all of a sudden you start developing some intestinal problems. It's not like that. It takes at least 15 to 20 years after exposure to asbestos to develop into one of those diseases, asbestosis, lung cancer, meso, or one of the other cancers.
Michael, the movie with Julia Roberts, was it?
I'm familiar
Brockovich?
with it. What's the name of it? What is it called again?
Brockovich?
Oh, yeah, Aaron Brockovich.
Yes.
Thanks for bringing it up.
So was that what they were working on?
It was very similar. It involved PG&E. It involved, who also was involved in asbestos, and it involved toxic chemicals like asbestos, but I don't believe it was specifically asbestos. One that, if you run a search right now, one a real kind of similar one that you're going to start hearing a lot more about is one that they call forever chemicals. It was basically Teflon. So it was used in Teflon pans. It was used in Gore-Tex jackets. And these chemicals, I don't know the exact words, but they never biodegrade. And they ultimately were dumped into various drinking waters, and just through the regular water system, though, there is contamination through these Teflon pans, nonstick coatings, using the washing machines to wash Gore-Tex and the other jackets. But there was hundreds of products or chemicals made. And I know that very recently, I believe it was Dow Chemical or 3M started settling these cases with different states, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, to compensate them. But that is a similar one. The Aaron Brockovich one, very similar, where there's dumping in the water. People end up drinking the water, take showers in the water, and maybe they don't develop disease, but their children do. And
what about spills, like, say, a train derailment?
Well, in a train derailment, you're always going to see, there's a very good chance you're going to see exposure to asbestos. These trains were loaded with them, different products, gaskets, insulation, brakes. The steam engines had a ton of them. Even when they switched to diesel, they had a lot. So there's going to be a lot of exposure or release of asbestos. But I think what we saw in Bethlehem, I think it was Bethlehem,
Yes.
Pennsylvania recently, it was what the train was carrying, and it was carrying some toxic chemicals. So then once there was the negligence of the operator, I don't know, driving too fast or something, those toxic chemicals were then released into the ambient air. And I know they have since settled, I believe, with the state. I don't know about with individuals, but that, there is a release of asbestos, but I think in these train derailment, you're more concerned about the immediate loss of life as well as the release of toxic chemicals into the air. But there's been train derailments with asbestos, sure, but it's not like these fumes or chemical. It's a dust that goes into the air, a flour, and just probably
Michael,
blows
so
around. I mean, go ahead.
how does one, maybe somebody's listening to the show now and they're going, well, how do I know if do I feel a certain way? And you said it doesn't always come on right away. How do people know?
Great question. And I ask clients that question all the time. Some of them, here's the things that I hear mentioned quite often. I had this persistent pain in my ribs or my side, and I couldn't figure it out. And I just thought it was a flu or the pneumonia. The other one is I kept having phlegm or buildup in my throat, and I couldn't figure out why. I didn't have a cold, but I still had this persistent cough, and they don't smoke cigarettes. So typically, those are the two indicia that I would see. I mean, obviously, if there's something more serious, which we've seen where, like some sort of lump in the ribs or the back, or if you're coughing up blood or digestively blood is coming out, then there is definitely something very severe going on.
What kind of
yes.
doctor does someone go to?
Well, most people start with their personal physician. And,
Okay.
I don't know if we've talked about this too much, but personal physicians, I find, really don't know a whole lot about
I wouldn't think they would.
Because if anybody comes in and says, I've got breathing problems, the first question they ask is, oh, have you ever smoked?
Yeah.
It's not. The first question isn't have you ever been exposed to asbestos? It's have you ever smoked? And doctors, I believe, almost presume that if somebody has breathing problems and they previously smoked cigarettes, then the doctors are presuming that breathing problem is COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a smoking related disease versus an asbestos disease. And the thing is, the disease can be both. There is a synergistic effect when somebody smokes and is exposed to asbestos in the workplace, where they are like 10 to 100 times more likely to get asbestos-related disease. So the smoking, in my mind, should never be a preclusion, but I feel from being diagnosed with asbestos, but I think for many personal physicians, it is. So to answer your question, I think the best is a referral to a pulmonary doctor, because a pulmonary doctor can run what's known as a PFT or a pulmonary function test, as well as take x-rays. And the x-rays will show whether or not there's any scarring, and the pulmonary function test gives you, say, 24 different scores between total lung capacity, forced vital capacity, and all of these scores. And there's certain scores that we have found are more attributable to asbestos, higher scores, and some which are more attributable to smoking. So a pulmonary doctor versus a family physician with a referral to a pulmonary doctor would be my advice.
We just got a text from somebody in Los Angeles. They want to know, can mold or mildew cause asbestos?
Different disease, but very serious and very significant as well. And also, mold is often latent. You don't know it or realize it when you have it, and it's often found later. Great question, different type of disease, but we also often see toxic mold in the same sorts of, or on the same sorts of products that have asbestos, like drywall would be a perfect example. So different disease, great question, but still very serious. And while I don't handle toxic mold cases, I do know a number of lawyers in my field who do.
Michael, how long does it normally take to get to the courthouse? And then how long does a trial usually last?
Another fantastic question, Steve-O.
I love your area of law.
Somebody has mesothelioma. There are motions you can file to expedite the case to trial. That is what you always do in a living mesothelioma case. What I like to tell people is maybe from first meeting to finish, maybe 9 months is about the quickest. Maybe 7 or 8 if you're lucky. And that's really expediting everything, getting what's known as a motion for preference approved by the trial judge to allow you to expedite the case and move it in front of other cases. So that's the fastest, but any other case is really on the slow track, especially in California, because when you file that case, you're put in line with every other case in the courthouse, every other car accident case, every other slip and fall case, and any other case in that Superior Court courthouse. You're just put in line. You're given a status conference date, and you've got to wait. And oftentimes between the mediations and the status conferences and the trial setting conferences and the, pushing back the trial date, and we're talking about probably 3 years.
Wow.
But I do want to say something, Steve, because this is very important. A lot of people are often hesitant to get involved in a case because they're like, wait a minute, I got to start this now. There's all this involved. I get you're going to spend the money and we're not going to spend the money. But if it takes 3 years, does that mean I'm not going to see any money for 3 years? And no, that is not the case. Mesothelioma cases, clients start seeing significant compensation relatively quickly. Oftentimes, once you file the complaint against somebody who you filed against complaints against previously, they may come to you and try and negotiate a very early settlement. And these settlements are not insignificant. So we're talking maybe within a month, you would start seeing some money. That's one way you might start seeing money. Another way is, of course, what's known as those bankruptcy claims. There are $30 billion in trust funds, which represent companies who used to make asbestos, have filed for they were sued, filed for bankruptcy. Many of them have now reorganized, and you might still see them. Manville, Certainty, USG. You can go in Home Depot and see these companies, but they filed for bankruptcy and they set up these fairly large but diminishing trust funds for victims. And so once we sign up a client, we can also file those bankruptcy claims almost immediately so that our clients are also seeing money come in the door while we are waiting to get to trial. If I were to, I would say if I were to break it down for a client, 25% of the money comes in the first 6 months, 75% comes in, well, let's say 10% comes in the middle, but the significant portion, 65%, comes as you get closer to trial. That's when the significant settlements come. That case that I told you about that just settled, and they were significant 6-figure settlements where we opened and the defendant settled. Those defendants could have settled that case months and months and months and months earlier. It wasn't our choice to make them wait. It's their choice. Right. And what I think is going on is the lawyers on the other side, they want to, unlike me, they're not like us. They bill by the hour. And so if they can extend this case to trial through every settlement conference and every deposition and every trial setting conference and every pretrial conference and every mediation, who wins? Their client doesn't win because they've got to pay them hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then they end up settling anyways. Okay, so they don't end up winning by doing that, but that's what many of them do.
Michael, is it normally a trial by jury, or does a judge decide this?
Jury. It's a jury trial, and it's not something where you need a unanimous verdict. You need a 12-0 or a 9-0, whatever state you're in. 6-3, if you've got a jury and it's 6-3, you lose. It's got to be 9-0. And so that's why there is a very big risk in taking a case to trial. And that's why, when you do go to trial, voir dire and the picking of your jury and the understanding of hopefully what's going on in their head is so important in these cases. Because if you lose just one juror, you lose the entire case.
Wow. What is the minimum, what is needed to file an asbestos lawsuit?
Answer that question. I answer that question every day. The minimum in my mind is it all starts with a diagnosis of an asbestos disease. Not I've got breathing problems and I worked around asbestos. Not, I was around it for 30 years. I'm sure I got it. It starts with a diagnosis. Now, with malignancy cases, lung cancer, laryngeal cancer, esophageal cancer, the diagnosis of the cancer is what will, start it for me. And that does usually come before they call my office. That usually happens before they call my office. But a diagnosis of a cancer or an asbestos disease, that's what's needed to file a case. We will figure out all of the different ways someone was exposed to asbestos because we know that many people don't know all the different ways. They might not know that their dad worked in a shipyard and by doing his laundry, they were getting exposed, or that their brother worked at the refinery and they helped out with the family laundry. That people don't know all the different ways. people just think, hey, well, if I cut asbestos or I worked with asbestos cement pipe, that was definitely asbestos, so I had to be exposed. There's many, many, many ways people could have been exposed.
It's amazing, Michael. I think of one question and then three more questions come up, which is why your area of law is so interesting.
Well, great. And I'm glad that you've really taken a liking to it, Steve.
Well,
And
you know what?
that's why our podcasts just fly by every time.
I know it's, you know what, Michael, if we can just touch one person every month. And, because I know there's people out there that do have questions. And maybe sometimes they're afraid to ask. They think maybe they sound stupid. Maybe they just don't know how about going about it. And you're really right. I'll bet you most of these physicians don't understand asbestos.
I would agree with you 100%. And here's how I know that, because typically they have a checklist. When I get their medical records, there's a different checklist that these physicians go down. And it'll say, things like smoking, chemicals, fumes, lived near a mine, worked in a mine, and they might have all of the, like for black lung disease. But on that checklist isn't asbestos. I mean, it should just be on there. Hey, did you work around asbestos? It's clearly a risk factor. Yeah, it's one of the risk factors that should be on the list. And they have all of these risk factors, and very few of them have asbestos. I don't want to say they all don't. And like you said, touching one person is important to me. My direct number is flashing across the screen. This is direct to my office. I pick up the phone, 415-895-5175. We also have an 800 number, which you can call. That is my call center. Usually after hours, they will pick up, but sometimes during the day as well. But the 415 number is direct to me, and anybody who wants to talk, they can call me anytime.
And Michael's with us every month. Michael, what if a person has excessive coughing and they actually worked with asbestos? Are they eligible for compensation?
I think there's a good chance they would be. So here's the steps that I would take with them. The first thing I would do, and I wouldn't retain them because I don't know if they would be a client, but what I would tell them is, I want to investigate a case for you. I think there is a good chance you might be eligible. The first step in determining whether or not you have an asbestos disease is if I can get a copy of your most recent X-ray or CT scan. If they haven't had an X-ray or CT scan, most people have, if they've got like that cough or lingering cough and breathing problems, then we will order the X-ray, we will pay for it, we will send it off to a doctor who will look at it and tell us, Mike, I think this person has underlying asbestos disease. We will then also get their pulmonary function test if they have one, which will show us their total lung capacity and let us further know whether or not they've got asbestos-related disease. And then we will take that along with their work history, their exposures, and send those medical records to another doctor to put it all together for what we call a causation report. And if he, in reviewing those records and reviewing those work history, will prepare and sign what's known as a causation report, saying that John Smith was exposed to asbestos at these sites, and I have reviewed his medical records and his x-rays and his radiologist exam and his pulmonary function test, and based on my medical expertise, I believe he has asbestosis, then it's game on for me. And that, to me, is a diagnosis. And so if somebody has a cough, it's going to start with us getting an x-ray. Sure, I'm going to want to know every place they're exposed to asbestos, but after I know whether or not they're sick. The first step is determining whether they're sick. And the first step in me determining that from anyone across the country is by getting an x-ray and letting a doctor, not me, somebody who's trained in identifying asbestos-related diseases and who I might send an x-ray to, comes back and it's negative. He tells me they don't have an asbestos-related disease. That happens all the time. But at least we know, and that person has some certainty. And if he comes back and he says they do, then I move forward and try and determine whether or not it is asbestosis. And I will go ahead and at that point retain them, start filing claims, and get them money as quickly and as expeditiously and as much as I can. Because as a contingency lawyer, I'll say it, we make more money if we get more for our clients. We've got skin in the game with every client. Unlike other lawyers, we want to get the best result for them because then we get the best result for our office. And so we don't get a good result if we bill 200 hours and then settle it. That's not how it works with us. We want to get the biggest settlements for our clients so we make the most for our office.
Is there a such thing as an average amount settlement?
Yes and no. There's certain trust claims that I will, like say a big mesothelioma claim with the Western Asbestos Settlement Trust. They were a company that sold supplied insulation in California, Minnesota, and a few other states. An average claim, and that's just one claim, with them probably pays about $450,000 for a mesothelioma victim. If someone were to ask me, what does the average mesothelioma case pay? If I knew the exposure, I could give you an answer because then I know what defendants you're going
Right.
after. But if I were to give an average generally, I'm going to say $3 to $5 million.
Wow.
On a mesothelioma case. On an asbestosis case, maybe $50,000 to $150,000. And again, I'm just giving ranges here.
Right.
Lung cancer, $100,000 to $1.5 million, depending on the defendants.
Michael, I could easily talk another hour on this. We've only got a few minutes left. Tell people again, how do they reach your office?
You can reach me. There's a number of ways. My call center, 1-800-970-DUST. 1-800-970-DUST, which is 3878. You can also reach me at directly 415. I'm here in Marin County, Novato, California. 415-895-5175. And of course, my email, which is Mandelbrot, Mandelbrot at asbestoslegalcenter.org. I try and answer every call and every email, and I really appreciate your time and the viewers' time and the listeners' time for taking the time. So thank you very much.
Well, actually, thank you. You'll be back with us again next month. Michael, thank you so much. You've just got so much information to share with everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Steve. And the time always flies with you.
And Happy New Year to you, too.
Thanks, Steve. Have a great day.
You too. And
right,
that's he's such a great attorney. That's it for us today. We'll be back again with you next week with more Ask the Experts.
Thanks for tuning in today to the Ask the Expert show on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV. Tune in next week and every week to hear more from our experts on personal injury, insurance, air condition repairs, estate planning, Medicare, and many other topics in the areas of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. See you next week.